We are really excited today to have David Gleish from Boston Housing Authority and Greg Abbe from the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, formerly DHCD, with us today to talk about utility allowances. And we're going to have Tom Chase from Mass Clean Energy Center facilitate the discussion. So we'll have presentations for 15 minutes from each presenter, and then we'll try to reserve 15 minutes for facilitated discussion at the end. If you have questions as they come up, just throw them in the chat, and then we'll make sure we address them as we get into the discussion. And I think really we're excited to dive into utility allowances. Many of you are probably deeply familiar with utility allowances, and we're very excited to talk through how they interact with retrofits and how you're thinking about assigning or updating utility allowances to best maximize retrofit opportunities as well, and ensuring affordability protections for everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to David Gleish. And just a reminder to mute yourself. I think Lydia, if you can mute, and others. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to David, and then we'll have Greg present, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Gleish, and I'm at the Boston Housing Authority. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint to run through with everybody here. Just give me a moment to sort through the little logistics here. So there we are. So again, just some background information on myself. I'm at the Housing Authority in Boston, where I serve as the Chief Officer of Leased Housing and Admissions. That means I oversee the voucher programs and all of the eligibility for our voucher programs in public housing. So at the Housing Authority in Boston, we've got about 18,500 vouchers and about 10,000 units of public housing hard units. So for us, really, at the BHA, utility allowances really only apply to our voucher side of the house, because all of the utilities are paid for by the BHA on the public side of the of our operation. So just give me 1 second. I'll jump into the background. Just having a little bit of issues with my mouse here. Hold on sorry, just bear with me momentarily here. Okay, there we go. So just some background. So federal housing law really tells us that the resident share of the rent and federally assisted housing is going to be 30% of the household's adjusted monthly income. And really HUD interprets that by saying the total tenant payment, the total resident payment for rent is going to incorporate both rent to the landlord, but also the cost of shelter, but also the cost for utilities. So they have this concept of the utility allowance that's been created. And really that's the amount that the housing authority determines is reasonable necessary to cover the residents' reasonable utility costs on a monthly basis. And so these allowances are really estimates of the expenses associated with the different utility types across the different uses. So utilities like are for electricity, natural gas, propane, fuel, oil. In some jurisdictions, not ours, wood or coal, water, sewage, and could be garbage collection. So like those are the different categories at which we assign a utility allowance for, and across all of the bedroom sizes as well. So utility allowance is really only calculated when an assisted family. So we kind of go through this annual process of figuring out what our utility allowances are going to be, but then the utility allowance only figures into the conversation or the calculation when the assisted family is paying or is responsible for those utilities. So for some units, the cost of utilities is built into the amount of rent charged by the owner. In these cases, the utility allowances just do not apply. So by definition, utility allowance is an amount equal to the estimate that the PHA, the Public Housing Authority, of the monthly cost of consumption of the tenant paid utilities by an energy conservative household. So it's kind of like a middle of the road consumption figure. And a family's utility allowance is determined by the size of the unit. So we have a chart which covers all different unit sizes across all those different utility types and sources. And so when a family's in a voucher unit, if they're in a 3-bedroom unit, but they are really only assigned a 2-bedroom voucher, they're going to get a lower amount of utilities, even though they're living in a larger apartment. So tenants can, rent a larger apartment under the voucher program, but they're going to get lesser benefit from utility allowances if they are overhoused. So again, each PHA or each housing authority is responsible for maintaining a utility allowance schedule for all tenant paid utilities. Utility allowances apply to the family's share of housing costs only when tenant pays. Telephone is not included. We kind of went through the different sources. The functions or end uses could be space heating, water heating, cooling, refrigeration, lighting, and all the different fuel sources. Cable, satellite television, internet service are not included in the schedule. They're considered non-essential by HUD. So the PHA has a couple different options to determine utility allowances on an annual basis. And I think across the board, one is predominantly used for housing authorities. And so really the PHA must use normal patterns of consumption for the community as a whole and current utility rates to develop a schedule. And HUD gives PHAs wide latitude in how they develop utility allowances for their public housing units. Although the federal regulations state that the various factors should be taken into account, they do not require that any particular methodology be used to calculate utility allowances. Instead, the PHA can kind of choose. However, I think the majority are looking at an engineering-based methodology, and HUD has its own tool available on its website that we can plug rates into and use some data to estimate utility allowances, as opposed to the consumption-based methodology, which is where a housing authority would develop utility allowances using actual consumption data from dwelling units in the PHA's portfolio. And the reason the BHA doesn't do that is because our units are across, we really administer vouchers within the 495 area. So those 18,000 plus vouchers that we have are within a very large jurisdiction, and getting that consumption data would be a massive effort. So we go with the engineering-based methodology. So I'll talk a little bit more about the process that we use. So we use what's called the HUD utility schedule model. It's frequently cited as HUSM, or I don't know how you'd say that, but it's a tool we use to calculate utility allowances. Essentially, it's in an Excel workbook at this point that can be downloaded from HUD's website, and I've left the link there. The current application uses regression models, and this version's based on 2009 residential energy consumption with some factors to increase. And that data set is published by the Energy Information Administration from the Department of Energy. So we're reviewing our annual utility allowances. So we're plugging in rates from the local utility companies into that model on an annual basis. And then we're looking at our own utility schedule from the last year, and we're revising anywhere that there's been a change in 10% or more of the utility rate since the last time the schedule was revised. So we're kind of looking and comparing year over year. Have there been changes? If so, we're going to update our own internal utility allowances. So here's like a sample view of our kind of basic utility chart for 2 to 3 family units, row houses, garden style units. And so you can see across the top, you've got your bedroom sizes, and then just the utility allowance for each type of, heating and the different types of fuel, all the way down. And so pretty straightforward in that regard. When you get to the bottom, you see allowances for refrigerator and range. And that really is for if a tenant is providing their own refrigerator or providing their own range, they would get a small allowance to do so. That's in a very minority of tenancies that we see.
I mean,
so I had mentioned this already, but essentially the family's going to get the benefit of the lower of their voucher size or the unit size that they're in. They're not going to be able to maximize the utility allowance if they are overhoused. And project-based units, they use the actual size for the unit. So if somebody's overhoused in a project-based unit, well, actually, if they're only entitled to a 2-bedroom, but they're in a 3-bedroom, they're still going to get the benefit of that 3-bedroom utility allowance when they're in a project-based unit, and that's opposed to a mobile voucher where they'd get the lower of. So here I just kind of tried to walk through the calculation, and I don't know how useful this is going to be, but I tried to take an example to show how utility allowances figure into our tenant calculation of rent. So in this example, we're looking at a 1-bedroom payment standard, and these numbers are just for example purposes, where the payment standard is $2,450, and the rent to the owner or the contract rent is $2,200. And just as a side note, anytime there's a rent where the BHA is approving that rent to make sure it's reasonable and within the market. And in this case, the utility allowance for tenant paid utilities, where the tenant's paying for electric heating and other electric, is $168. We end up with a gross rent figure of $2,368. So we have a kind of a gross rent calculation, $2,368. And that's always, so in our calculations, we're always comparing that gross rent to the payment standard, where the gross rent is less than the payment standard or equal to the payment standard. That ensures the tenant is going to pay 30% of their monthly adjusted income towards rent and utilities. Once the gross rent exceeds the payment standard, that number gets higher. And so higher utility allowances will push you over that number quicker. Then that means the tenant is going to pay more than 30%. In fact, they pay dollar for dollar every dollar the gross rent increases over the payment standard. So we're kind of basing our calculation. We're looking at the lower of that gross rent or payment standard number. So here in this calculation, we're looking at the lower of the 2,368. We determine the tenant's 30%, and then we figure out our HAP by taking the gross rent minus the tenant's 30%. We get that 2008 number, and then we can figure out from there the family's rent to the owner. So in this case, the family is going to pay $192 to rent for the owner. Now their 30%, as you recall, is that 360 number, but they're going to get the remainder, the difference there, that $168. They're going to take that out of their pocket and pay their utilities, right? So that's kind of how the utility allowance calculation works in the voucher program. Hopefully that's a fairly straightforward example that helps you kind of understand how that math works. And so where the family is zero income or very low income, there's often, we'll see calculations where we're in fact sending the family a check so that they can pay their utilities. So if that family had zero income in the prior example, it would come out that, their share of rent to the owner would be zero and they had no ability to pay utilities either. The BHA would in fact send them a check, and we have quite a few of our families where that is the case, especially where the utility allowances are high. We're not always sending all of the utility allowance, but sometimes a portion of that full utility allowance to the tenant. And this may or may not apply, be useful, but we can decide how frequently we want to send out those utility allowances checks. We can wait for a balance. So if we only owe the tenant, $1 a month, then those utility allowance payments, maybe we would only pay them every, once a year or every 6 months. So we weren't sending a direct deposit or a check every month. And then just as I mentioned at the outset of my presentation, the BHA really doesn't figure utility allowances into public housing. So because all of the utilities are provided for BHA residents. So utilities are certainly figured into our day-to-day operations as they're a huge cost for the housing authority, but the utility allowances themselves don't figure into resident calculations. So I think that's concludes my presentation. Looking forward to questions at the end, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my colleague, Greg Abbe from EOHLC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm also getting used to saying EOHLC. I still say DHCD every now and again. Sharing my screen, let me know, everybody, if you can see it. I think you probably can. So I'm here to talk about the state-aided public housing portfolio, not the federal side, and the MRVP initiative. But first, my name is Greg Abbe. As I mentioned, I'm the Sustainability Program Developer here at EOHLC, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, formerly DHCD. I work within the Division of Public Housing, and specifically I work on the capital side, meaning I help housing authorities with construction-related topics typically. And specifically, my focus is on helping housing authorities reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, make their properties more resilient to different types of climate hazards, and improve the indoor air quality within those buildings. That all is to say that I don't work on the housing management side, and they're the folks who do a lot of the different things around rent calculations, utility calculations, and so on. I've got the information from them, but anything that I don't know, I can take down information and get those answers for folks as quick as I can. So let's start off by talking about state-aided public housing. There's federal public housing, there's state-aided public housing. And on the state-aided side, there's something called ANUEL, or Allowable Non-Utility Expense Level. This is something that EOHLC sets, working with different housing authorities. And for the most part, EOHLC provides many housing authorities, actually, I'll take that back, most housing authorities with operating subsidy. It's the funds that are used to operate the properties. EOHLC also provides capital funding to every housing authority to help actually do construction projects on the buildings. But that operating subsidy is calculated with the formula that you see there, which is that ANUEL value, whatever budget exemptions there might be, depending on what the housing authority is or isn't eligible for, what their actual utility costs were for that given fiscal year, minus whatever revenues the housing authority's taken in, which predominantly are rents. And there are two different types of local housing authorities that sort of come out of that operating subsidy calculation. There are deficit housing authorities, and those are those that receive operating subsidy because their revenues are not in excess of those costs. or surplus housing authorities, which are those that have sufficient revenue to cover their expenses, including actual utility costs. So for housing authorities, how do quote unquote allowances work? In the state housing portfolio, it's quite simple. For those deficit authorities where they're receiving operating subsidy, we reimburse them for their utility costs, full stop. One-to-one, the housing authority spends $100,000 on electricity in a fiscal year, we reimburse them for $100,000 worth of cost. For surplus housing authorities, there is no utility reimbursement. And so it sets up some interesting incentives around energy conservation. For surplus housing authorities, let's say, if they reduce their costs from $100,000 to $50,000, they get to keep the $50,000. For deficit housing authorities, if they reduce their costs from $100,000 down to $50,000, then EOHLC just gives them $50,000 less. Now that means that EOHLC has more money in our general fund that we can then dole out to housing authorities. So there is a benefit, but it isn't necessarily a one-to-one benefit tied to cost reduction. What about residents? Do residents pay for any utilities within the state-aided public housing portfolio? And the answer is sometimes. Leases can stipulate, typically, whether or not residents pay for electricity, heat, water, or hot water in this case. And residents may pay for some of those, all of those, or none of those, depending on the particular development. And the calculation for how rent is determined depends on whether or not the resident pays for the utilities and what type of development they're living in. So for example, if a tenant of elderly or handicapped housing does not pay for any utilities, then rent is 30% of monthly net household income. But if they pay for some or all of the utilities, rent is 25% of monthly net household income. If the tenant is in family housing and they don't pay for utilities, rent is 32% of monthly net household income. Where the tenant pays for one or more utilities, but not all of them, then rent is 30%. And where the tenant pays for all of them, rent is 27%. So just high level, when we talk about electrification, sometimes there are cost increases involved, particularly if you're going from natural gas to electricity, though this isn't always the case. And those cost increases typically are felt on the utility cost side, not necessarily maintenance or general upkeep. But if the housing authority pays for utilities, then they just submit to EOHLC for increased expenses. It would be the same as if, for example, this past winter, when electricity and gas rates went up quite a bit, those housing authorities that were affected simply submitted for higher reimbursement from EOHLC. If residents pay for utilities, the LHA can renegotiate the leases to switch responsibility from the residents to the housing authority. However, depending on what type of development the resident lives in, and depending on how many utilities they are or are not responsible for, rent may go up per that calculation that I showed you on the previous slide. So that's how allowances, although I think that word is a little loose, works with state housing, public housing. So let's talk now about Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, or MRVP. There are two types of vouchers. There are mobile vouchers, and these are tied to the tenant, and the tenant can use these vouchers at market rate rental properties pretty much anywhere. And then there are project-based vouchers, and these are tied to a specific unit. They don't move around with a resident. They are tied to a specific unit and the folks that live there. In these situations, tenants can pay for all or none or some of the utilities, depending on the type of the unit and what the lease says. If the tenant pays for any of the utilities, then there is an allowance, and I'll show you on the next slide what that is. And leases typically stipulate that the tenants pay for heat, hot water, or other electric as sort of the high-level categories that might be at play here. These leases auto-renew for both types of vouchers, but for mobile vouchers, the owner of the property could propose new lease terms and change who is responsible for paying which type of utility, but the tenant does not have to necessarily accept those new lease terms. And the leases auto-renew, so really the only surefire way for an owner in that case to renegotiate what that language says is for the tenant to move out at some point of their own volition, or if it's related to something else. For project-based vouchers, the owner has to wait until the point of turnover to change the lease terms. So it's similar. And the last slide that I have for you is what this this allowance looks like. You can see that there is a heat utility allowance and an other electric utility allowance, and it's tied to the style of unit. So if it's a studio, then there's a $30 heat utility allowance and a $16 other utility allowance, all the way up to a 6-bedroom, 4-bedroom, etc. So it's regardless of what the particular voucher size is, that's what the allowance is. And it scales with the size of the building. And that is the end of my piece of today's presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, David. That was a really helpful introduction to the very complicated world of utility allowances. We have a couple of questions that came through. First, a couple of clarifying questions. One came in for David. Does the BHA pay for plug-in electric heat for the tenant, i.e. they get no electric bill? And the answer there is correct for federal public housing. And then the other clarifying question that I wanted to put to both of you is cooling included in utility allowance calculations?
So the BHA doesn't have a cooling and air conditioning utility allowance, and it's kind of unclear whether or not we're required to have one. But in buildings with central AC, it's probably likely that we should. We just have not historically. So if you look at the federal program nationwide, especially in warmer climates, you'll see a utility allowance for cooling.
I don't believe that there is any utility allowance per se related to cooling, other than in the state-aided public housing portfolio. If a housing authority has cooling, or if residents have their own air conditioners and they don't pay for utilities, then that's all rolled up in what EOHLC reimburses the housing authority for. So it just sort of melds in with everything else.
Thank you. So the next question from Tina Miller, I think this is for David. How does BHA determine if a lease unit has an Energy Star certification or other significant certification, or has conducted, let's say, an energy efficiency improvement rehab project? And then related to that, second part of the question is, are we expecting any changes to the HUD utility model for, say, passive house construction?
So I don't know that there's any changes on the horizon. But so what I can say is that, as I described, we figure a utility allowance for a very large area across, a large, a large stock of really different housing, because, and it doesn't consider whether the utilities are more efficient or not. And this is something we've been grappling with at the BHA. It's really providing an average. So, in a very efficient, somebody who's retrofitted a three-decker with very efficient systems and maybe upgraded the windows, well, the utility is going to be much less expensive, but the tenant's going to be provided a much larger utility allowance maybe than they need. So there'll be a tenant savings and a very efficient building, if the utilities, if the owner is paying utilities, which we don't see very frequently in a tenant-based arrangement, then it's potential that the owner could get a higher contract rent. And we're actually looking at now, how do we assign higher contract rent values to units that are deemed efficient? And so we're trying to sort out what makes a unit, what are the criteria that make a unit efficient? How can we verify that? And what's the appropriate valuation to increase the rent to make that an attractive option for owners who maybe have not made their units efficient yet, but also to incentivize those that have.
Great. The next question is for Greg. So on the MRVP, is the rent the net of the utility allowance, or is the contract rent the fair market?
I believe that the rent and the utility allowances are completely separate. That if you have, say, a mobile voucher and you go to a place that's on the open market, you use the voucher to help pay for rent, and then the utility allowance is something that's completely separate from that.
Thank you. This is a question, I think, for both of you, Lydia Lowe, and it's one of the hot button topics, the reason we're having the conversation today. But if electrification leads to a tenant receiving a higher utility bill, and there's no intent to change who's paying utilities for a unit, how or would the utility allowance be adjusted? Is the first part of the question. And the second part of the question then is a tax credit or other state-supported private housing following similar protocols for utilities?
I'll jump in and just say that actually I was going to ask Lydia for clarification on what she means by electrification. Does that mean switching from gas?
Yes.
Sure. So if there's no intent to, if there's a change in utility sources or fuels, there's really no requirement to sign a new housing assistance payments contract in the voucher program. But the utility allowances for electric heat or heat pump are quite a bit higher than they are for gas on our utility chart right now, I think. And so actually the calculation would change a bit, likely making the unit more energy efficient, but in some ways the costs get thrown off a little bit differently. The key factor is to kind of look into the calculations in a detailed manner. I had talked about how that gross rent is going to affect the tenant's payment. If that gross rent exceeds the BHA's payment standards, the tenant's going to start paying out of pocket. So in some cases, that switch from gas to a more expensive electric utility could actually force the tenant's affordability above the 30% or even higher. So, I mean, it's really something that, should be looked at before making the change in terms of the tenant's affordability. And, obviously, if the contract rent can be increased, then that's also a possibility to just try to keep the tenant's rent affordable. But, certainly can be problematic under the current structure.
Yeah, and I would say that on the electrification front and how that impacts MRVP utility allowances specifically, I am not familiar with deliberations around adjusting the utility allowance schedule. I know that this question is a hot button topic, and it's certainly being discussed and trying to figure out how to accommodate that. But I'm not familiar with what the details of those conversations are. So at this point, I'm just not sure.
How do we find out more about that conversation or get in on it?
Contact the folks in that particular division of EOHLC, who oversee the MRVP program.
Okay, can you maybe share that information? And then what about other kinds of state-supported housing that's not public housing or MRVP?
At least from my perspective, again, if it's outside of state-aided public housing, I can't say for sure because I don't work on those programs or initiatives. And frankly, the same as with MRVP. So you would need to follow up with those different folks.
But yeah, that's a great question. I know if maybe if you could send to Emily, the folks at LISC and me if you have my contact info, but we are just trying to keep a running list of everywhere this question pops up. So if there are housing types that we're missing in this conversation, that would be great to know.
And yeah, I see your question about the LIHTC stuff, which I'm just not an expert enough on to really be, give you an answer there about how the costs would play into those calculations.
I had a question, David, for you about federal public housing. Although BHA pays all the utilities in your portfolio, that's not always the case for PHAs. So I was wondering if you could just give us the high level on how utility allowances work in public housing authorities where residents pay some or all of the utilities. That would be great. And then the follow-up question to that is when utility costs increase for you, for BHA and that public housing stock, where do those funds come from for the increased utilities?
So so I can't really answer your first question with any kind of solid knowledge, but my assumption is that the ratio, again, the federal housing law covers both programs. So the tenant is going to be paying 30% essentially of their monthly adjusted income towards rent and utilities. So as utility costs would go up for a public housing authority resident, their kind of share of the rent would go down if that was the arrangement. So very similar to what happens in the voucher program. What was the second question, Tom?
The second question is just for those utilities that BHA or any public housing authority is paying themselves, when those go up, where do you feel the crunch and where do you see subsidy?
So it comes out of operating fund, and those bills are, gigantic. And so obviously whatever the BHA can do to continue to save utilities, it's money that we can spend elsewhere. And so, I think the problem for public housing authorities is that we don't necessarily have the dollars to do the conversions that are necessary to make the BHA energy efficient. Although I know we are, kind of now entering this kind of 10-year plan to get ourselves to be carbon neutral, which will be an incredible effort and take a lot of outside dollars beyond the public housing funding that we receive from the feds. So, that's where we are with that.
Question from Andrew Howard, or if I'm saying that correctly, Howard. New higher electric utility allowances effective August 1 came out from the Worcester Housing Authority, or published by the Worcester Housing Authority shortly after Eversource rates went up, and new utility allowances aren't keeping up with those new rates. Are there ever mid-year changes to rates when situations like that?
I am not sure. I don't believe that there typically are, but I can certainly take that back and pass that along to the folks who take a look at it.
I mean, if there's enough of an increase, the BHA will look at that at any time. I mean, we have to look at it at least annually. but we can certainly look at it more frequently than that. And, actually, we're just redoing our utility allowances, and, the electric is the biggest. It's just, there's just giant increases in electric from last year. So if landlords were to say, or, it's really, again, it's really an issue that's going to affect tenants in our portfolio more than landlords. And so, but we can do it more than once if there's a need.
Andy, can you clarify? Did you say the rates, Eversource rates are going down 25%?
Yes.
Sorry, I misread that.
We got the new rates from WHA saying effective August 1st, they're going up, and they are going up hugely. And a week after we got that, we got a notification from Eversource saying, oh, well, our kilowatt hour rates are going down 25% effective August 1st. And I think the point is that the market is so traumatic right now. It really is more than volatile, that it seemed a little peculiar to hear, yes, you're getting less rent because the utility allowances are up. And then a week later here, oh, and by the way, your rates are down 25%. This year is not going to be like any other year in my 40 plus years of working in the field in terms of utility rates, especially electric.
Again, the other thing to consider there is, I think you have to kind of take the long view, because once a utility chart is provided, that tenant is going to be stuck with that utility allowance for the full year, unless there's an interim calculation for some reason. So even a change in the utility allowance chart by the housing authority might not at least in a tenant-based or even a project-based situation, that utility allowance chart won't take effect for those tenants until the next time they come in for their annual.
Follow-up question from Lindsay Gale, going off Lydia's question, but developers of private affordable housing, for instance, tax credits, could an organization complete their own utility allowance study to use in setting their utility allowances, and then what agency would have authority over that?
I have to imagine it's probably EOHLC, probably in the housing development group, if I had to guess, but I'm not sure. They're the ones who look at the low income housing tax credit initiatives.
And then a question from Richard. Several other states allow 3 calculation methods: engineering, consumption, and calculated averages. My understanding is that Mass doesn't allow the first 2, and will that change in the near future? And I'm not sure about if this one is directed to Greg or David, so I'm not sure, Richard, if you were able to come off mute and clarify.
Anybody that can answer, frankly, because I mean, again, like that's every other state that I'm involved in, that's HUD standard for calculating utility allowances. But my understanding that Massachusetts doesn't allow the first 2 calculations. Period. Like across the board, tax credits, MRVPs, Section 8, it falls in all the categories.
Well, for Section 8, it's a federally subsidized program. So those first 2 methodologies you see are going to be utilized to calculate the utilities. I'm not as clear on the state methods for calculating the utility.
Unfortunately, I'm not either.
And I do have to say, like on the Section 8 side, that HUD has said it's based on whoever the CA is that's managing that contract, and that CA makes up the rules, and those CAs are saying that they do not allow the first two methods either.
So, right, so for BHA, we use those HUD methods, but if it were the state was the holder of the vouchers or any of its contract administrators, then they would use the state's methodology for doing the utility allowances. So I think that's where there's inconsistencies with the way the BHA, the Boston Housing Authority, calculates its utility allowances versus the EOHLC. And then, you know, I do think there's a lot of housing authorities that tag off or that just kind of like take the BHA's utility allowances when we calculate them. And so it's consistent across the state. So, you know, obviously the inconsistencies do make things difficult across the.
But I think that answers Lydia's questions and a lot of the other questions, right? Especially around, because electrification is required on new projects. And, you know, and if we're getting money to do energy retrofit programs and we're creating higher efficient buildings, if those two methods were allowed, you know, it would solve a majority of these issues as it relates to, you know, higher than what we expect utility costs. Because that's, I mean, as an owner, developer, and investor, that's money directly out of our pocket after we've already spent the extra money to retrofit a building to make it more energy efficient.
Sounds like a good question to tag for some follow-up investigation, for sure. And I know that we wanted to save some time for announcements and updates at the end. So I think we've gotten to all the questions that came up in the chat. Wasn't sure if there are any last questions. Thanks again to the presenters very much for joining and sharing with us today. I'll hand it back to.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, David and Greg. That was very informative. And yeah, it sounds like we have some additional potential avenues of advocacy or questions that we can sleuth into. Courtney, it looks like you might have a question. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if I could summarize what I feel like I've been hearing here, which is the way that the utility allowance structure is currently set up. It isn't really set up to incentivize developers to do a deep energy retrofit and electrification. You know, we've been doing it where we're trying to take on landlord paid utilities to perhaps be able to get more permanent loan if it works in our favor to have utility allowances. It seems like right now it's not being thought of. Is that kind of what I'm hearing, or did I miss something?
That seems like a fair assessment of the situation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that, yeah, it doesn't, we don't pass the incentive on to the landlord. It really is benefiting, especially when it's tenant use assigned utilities. It's going to benefit the tenant, but there's really no way to pass that benefit at this point along to the landlord. And again, at the BHA, we are trying to figure out a way to assign higher contract rent values to those apartments that are deemed efficient. But again, that's a process we're working.
Got it.
Yeah, it seems like it might need a brain trust of this group to help us get to the 21st century on this. So yeah, so if folks have, maybe we can do a little thinking of potential solutions that people are seeing, and we could shop those around and see what the powers that be think about them. But would really invite anybody's ideas on how it could be better incentivized to protect affordability and incentivize owners and recognize owners for this transition. Lindsay, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, it seems to be that maybe a follow-up conversation with Greg, some of your other colleagues at EOHLC would maybe be a place to start to see, you know, yeah, on that side of things, if there are avenues available to us that we're maybe not yet aware of.
I think that's right. I've been taking notes on folks' questions, and I'm going to send those along to as many of the relevant folks as I can think of. But I think you're right. Ultimately, it comes down to a number of different people across a number of different divisions, all kind of sitting down and tackling a common conundrum.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. We'll happy to follow up and let's figure out maybe how we can have a session with developers and EOHLC team if they're interested in hearing more feedback and ideas on this. Okay, well, really appreciate everybody's input and participation. And we will share recording and slides. If you have additional questions, please reach out or thoughts on this. And sounds like we'll continue the conversation in some form. And now I just want to turn it over. We just had one announcement on our radar. I'm going to have Lauren Bauman speak to the HUD Green and Resilient Retrofit Program opportunity that may be available to folks if you have HUD assisted properties we wanted to flag. And then if anybody else has an announcement that would be relevant for this group, just raise your hand. But I'm going to pass the mic to Lauren to give a quick plug, and then just raise your hand if you have any other, or put it in the chat if you have any other announcements for this group. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so as Emily had mentioned, there is a funding opportunity that's currently available from HUD under Green and Resilient Retrofit. It's specifically for HUD-assisted multifamily properties to improve their efficiency, reduce carbon emissions, improve health and comfort, and climate resilience. There's 3 different sort of pathways or cohorts that are being offered under this opportunity, and mostly based on sort of the level of development of a particular project. So if you've got a project that kind of fits the category and is currently under design, there is an opportunity specifically for adding efficiency and carbon emissions reduction measures that maybe you haven't been able to include because you haven't had the resource to be able to do that. There's about $40,000 per unit potentially available under this competitive competition for that. There's also cohorts specific to project teams that are moving full steam ahead with really high efficient projects, retrofit projects that are pursuing certifications, as well as a pathway for projects that maybe are not quite as far ahead in their development process, but want to set really ambitious targets around emissions reduction and climate resilience, and maybe need some technical assistance help to be able to incorporate that. So anywhere between $40,000 and $80,000 a unit, depending on the cohort, available to projects. There are going to be multiple waves of application for this. So actually the first wave of application for the first cohort is due tomorrow, but there are a couple other waves that are coming up in the next couple of months for the other 2 cohorts. And then there's going to be 4 phases of application review for each of the cohorts over the next year or so. So don't think that if you didn't have this on your radar that you've missed the opportunity. Folks should definitely be looking at their potential retrofit and rehab pipelines for their HUD-assisted multifamily properties and seeing if there's a good fit and a way to really incorporate increased emissions reductions through this program. I know there could be a lot of questions about whether properties that you have actually qualify for the program. HUD is doing office hours essentially every week between now and July 19th. They've been doing them for a little while. They actually have recordings posted on their website of the previous office hours, but every Wednesday until the 19th between 3 and 4 p.m. you can log on and there's folks from HUD there that are available to answer questions real time about eligibility and approach. So highly recommend that folks look into this. LISC team has a memo that essentially outlines some of the details on this that we'll include with the slides for this presentation, so folks can dig in a little more deeply.
Thank you, Lauren. And really thank you for leading on keeping abreast of that program. It's really important resources for the field. Okay, good. Well, if no one has any other announcements, we will close a few minutes early. Thank you all. We'll be in touch with our next session probably in September, but if you're thinking about agenda items, or if you have topics for the energy cohort you want us to cover in the next year, just reach out. We're always looking for new topics that are of interest for the field. So thank you all. Thanks again to David, Greg, and Tom, and hope everyone has a safe and lovely holiday weekend ahead.